Happy Father's Day. Thank you to all the dads that are here today. Thank you we appreciate the opportunity to celebrate dads. When I was in college, I had the opportunity had the assignment of, so was forced to, but wrote a paper along the lines of looking at how dads have been portrayed in sitcoms throughout the years. And it's amazing just kind of how that portrayal has changed throughout the last 50, 60 years. A lot of times dads are easy to make fun of. You look at Homer Simpson, you look at Everybody Loves Raymond, and dads are easy to make fun of. But at the same time, good dads are needed everywhere. They're an integral part of our country, integral part of our community. They're a big part of our church, too. And so we thank you to the dads that are doing what God has called them to do. Over the last few weeks, we've been in Hebrews 11, and there's several parents in Hebrews 11 that are mentioned there as we talk about what it looks like to live out faith. We talk about how Noah saved his family by faith. Abraham, Isaac passed along the blessing to his children by faith. Jacob passed along a blessing to his children and grandchildren by faith. Moses' parents lived out their faith in everything they did. Everything they did is they put Moses into that basket so that he would be found by Pharaoh's daughter. And so we're going to continue in Hebrews 11 this morning. But the subject changes just a little bit. It's not so much parents this morning, it's the subject of choices. And as I was doing some reading this week, we make a lot of choices in a day. Of course, 97% of stats online are made up, but several different websites, whatever, had cited sources of how many choices we make in a day. Think about that. How many choices do you think you make in a day? There's quite a few choices that we make every single day. Now, I don't have an actual accurate number. Anything that I found online was anywhere between 70 choices in a day to 230 to 35,000. So the truth is, we have no idea how many choices we make. But as I think through my day, as I think through my morning, yeah, there's a lot of choices that we make. The alarm clock goes off or we wake up. Instant choice. Am I going to get out of bed right now? Or am I going to hit snooze and go back to sleep? Because when I hit snooze, then I have the exact same choice again in 5 minutes or 9 minutes or whatever it is. It's a choice. What are we going to do there? When we get up, as you stand out of bed, which step are you going to step with first? That's a choice that has to be made. Which pair of socks am I going to wear today? Which shirt am I going to wear today? As you go down the stairs, which foot goes first down the steps? I'm thinking about that for myself. I actually don't know which foot goes down the step first. It's probably a different one every day. I don't put a lot of thought into that choice, but nonetheless, it's a decision that has to be made. You get downstairs, what's for breakfast? What am I going to eat for breakfast today? Do I need to shower today? Am I going to be around people? Do I really need to put deodorant on today? Yes, I need to put deodorant on today. My wife reminded me of that when I brought this up last night. Yes, that should never be a question. But still, that's a decision that has to be made. There's all sorts of choices that we make every single day, every single hour. Every half hour, there's probably 10 or 12 choices that you make. And so we're going to talk a little bit about the choices that we make today. We're going to continue in Hebrews 11, talking about what it looks like to live out our faith. Faith is a very active thing. The idea of believing in Jesus is not just something that we do in our mind. It's something that we live out. It's something that we put action to. And so faith is something that we do. And throughout this chapter, there's been men and women that have lived out their faith. And we talk about who those people are. Last week, we talked about Moses' parents. This week, we get a chance to talk about Moses himself. We're going to read Hebrews 11, beginning in verse 24. Hebrews 11, verse 24 says, "By faith, Moses, when he had grown up, refused to be known as the son of Pharaoh's daughter. He chose to be mistreated along with the people of God, rather than to enjoy the fleeting pleasures of sin. He regarded disgrace for the sake of Christ as of greater value than the treasures of Egypt, because he was looking ahead to his reward." Every story that we read in Hebrews 11 starts with these same two words: by faith, by faith, by faith. By faith, Moses does this. By faith, Moses makes a choice. By faith, Moses chooses to answer those big burning questions of life of, who am I? And a subset of that is, with whom do I belong? What kind of people do I belong with? Who am I? And Moses makes an incredible decision here. He says, I refuse to be known as the son of Pharaoh's daughter. That is not who I am. Chris talked about this story last week, and it's mentioned in the verse before this, and then back in Exodus 2 as well. Moses grew up in the household of Pharaoh's daughter. His parents had put him in a basket to save his life, and Pharaoh's daughter finds him and adopts him into her family. Yes, his parents raise him until he's of age to go back to Pharaoh's daughter's household. But he grows up in this household in Egypt, and he grows up as an Egyptian boy, the son of Pharaoh's daughter. And from the time that he enters into her household until he's about 40 years old, he's in this household, in one of the most powerful households in the world at that time, in the civilized world. And yet Moses refuses to be known as one of those people. He's not an Egyptian. That's not who I am. He says, I refuse to be known by that. He says, that's not my identity. That's not who I am. That's a big burning question in life of, who am I? And that's a question that we have to answer time and again throughout our lives. It comes up so many different times throughout our lives. Who am I? Who am I really? We ask that question when we're turning 13, 14, 15. Who am I now? What kind of person am I? What is my identity here? It's a question that we ask of ourselves when we're 18, 19, 20 and leaving our parents' household. Who am I? I'm no longer just one of my parents' kids. I'm me, but who is me? Who am I? It's a question that we ask again when we get married, when we have kids, when our kids leave the household. Who am I? I think that's very much a question that gets asked when the kids leave, of your identity has been wrapped up in your kids for the last 20 plus years. And all of a sudden the kids are out of the household. Who am I? Who actually am I? We ask it again at retirement. If my life has been defined by my work throughout my life and all of a sudden I retire, who am I? It's a question that's asked throughout our lives. Who am I? And along with that is another question of, who do I belong with? Who are my group of people? We're made to belong somewhere. We're made to belong with others. God says to Adam in the Garden of Eden, it's not good for man to be alone. Now, he says that in the context of marriage, but I think that's true in all of life. It's not good for us to be alone. We belong with others. And so the question becomes, who do we belong with? Who are my people? I grew up listening to country music, and so what comes to my mind is Rodney Atkins. These are my people. This is where I come from. Right? And Moses answers that question here. He says, these are my people. Not those Egyptians. God's people, the descendants of Abraham. These are my people. The Israelites. When you go back to the backstory in Exodus, or when you read the story in Acts chapter 7, Stephen references back to Moses. And both of those stories bring up the point that when Moses gets to this age, it says he goes out to his own people. His own people. Moses knew who his people were. He knew who he was. He wasn't an Egyptian. He was an Israelite. He was one of the group of people that followed the one true God. And so by faith, when he had grown up, he refused to be known as the son of Pharaoh's daughter. He chose to be mistreated along with the people of God, rather than to enjoy the fleeting pleasures of sin. Sometimes I appreciate the honesty of Scripture. The fleeting pleasures of sin. It's an accurate description. The writer of Hebrews is not trying to gloss over the fact that sometimes sin can be fun. Sometimes there's a pleasure that's derived from sin. But it's a fleeting pleasure. It's not something that lasts. It's here and it's gone. When you go back to the very first sin, Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, it says that Eve looked at the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and she saw that it was pleasing to the eye and desirable for food. It looked really, really good. God had told them, do not eat that fruit, but she looked at it and it looked really good. Scripture does not say this. This is my own personal opinion. I would bet that when she took a bite of that fruit, I'll bet it tasted really good. I mean, it tasted good enough for her to give it to her husband. It was created by God. It probably tasted delicious. The fleeting pleasures of sin. It might have tasted delicious in that moment, but man, the regret, the pain, the shame from all of that. We still experience that in our world today. Look at the destruction that is caused in our world by the fleeting pleasures of sin. The idea of getting drunk. Sure, there's a certain pleasure in that in the moment. But it quickly passes the next morning. There's not a pleasure there. It's a fleeting pleasure. On a big picture, look at how many households, how many families are destroyed in our country, in our communities by alcoholism. How many lives are ruined by drunks every year? The fleeting pleasures of sin. Sure, sex before marriage sounds really, really fun, really, really good. And the writer of Hebrews would not deny that there is a certain pleasure in that, but it's a fleeting pleasure. A misuse of this beautiful thing that God has created. An inability to experience that intimacy that God created and that God designed. To where what we experience and what we come up with falls so far short of what God designed. Look at how our poor view of marriage in this country has led to so many divorces, so many households that are falling apart, that have split apart, and kids get bounced from here to there, and that's not the plan. That's not the way it's supposed to be. The fleeting pleasures of sin. But it says, by faith, Moses chose something different than that. Moses chose to be mistreated along with the people of God rather than to enjoy the fleeting pleasures of sin. And he regarded disgrace for the sake of Christ as of greater value than the treasures of Egypt because he was looking ahead to his reward. I want to focus on a couple more things out of this. First is that reward. Moses was focused on his reward. He had his eyes to the prize, the greater value. He says that the treasures of Christ are far greater than the treasures of Egypt, and that's coming from a man who grew up in the household of the daughter of Pharaoh. To think of all the treasures that Moses turned his back on, the wealth that I'm sure was available to him, the power that was available to him, the lineage. I don't know how the Egyptian pharaohs passed one pharaoh to the next, but I would have imagined that if Moses is in this household, in this family, it could be conceivably said that maybe he was in line to the throne. And he turns his back on all of it. I'm sure Moses had some really nice perks in his life. Perks like never having to work very hard, never having to make a brick in his life. I'm sure he didn't know how to make bricks. And yet he chooses to go out and be with the people of Israel, who that's all they do, is make bricks. Moses looked forward to the rewards, though. Moses looked forward to the promises of God. He knew that God had promised Abraham that Abraham's descendants would be slaves to a foreign country for 400 years, and then he would lead them out to the promised land. Joseph, just a couple generations before Moses, had reminded his family of that, and they looked forward to that promise. And later in his life, Moses gets a chance to be a part of that exodus, that leaving Egypt and heading back to the promised land. He's looking forward to those rewards here in this story. Something interesting that I came across this week. Moses looked forward to the promised land, certainly, but as the story goes, Moses never actually gets to set foot in the promised land. He doesn't quite get there. His sin keeps him out God says you can look on it from a high place, but you don't get to enter. And Moses dies and he never enters the promised land. There's a story in Jesus' life where Jesus takes Peter, James, and John and they go up on a mountain. And Jesus is transfigured on the mountaintop. And they see Jesus with Elijah and Moses. And one writer that I was reading makes the comment, at least, that this perhaps was Moses' first time setting foot in the promised land. Interesting way to look at it. As I look at that, I'm thinking, I'll bet that didn't mean near as much to Moses in that moment for him to set foot in that promised land when he had already experienced the glories of heaven. He had already died. He had been at the Father's side in heaven. Who cares about a little piece of ground on earth? Moses looked forward to his reward, to the treasures that have been laid up. It's like a story that Jesus told of a man who was digging in a field and he found buried treasure, which sounds like the start of any young boy's story. Digging in a field and finding buried treasure. And Jesus says this guy, when he found it, he buried it again, and he went and he sold everything he had so that he could go and buy this field and dig up that buried treasure. That treasure was worth more than everything the man had. All of his clothes, all of his tools, all of his household possessions, everything. He sold all of it. He did whatever it took to get that treasure. Moses knew how valuable the treasure was that he looked forward to. I think I've brought up this statement before. It's one that has resonated with me for a long time. Some famous preacher, I don't remember who it was, made the comment one time that until sin is bitter, Christ will not be sweet. And his concept of that was until we grasp the weight of our sin, the destruction and the punishment that our sin deserves, until we grasp how bitter that sin is, it's difficult to understand what Jesus did on the cross. I don't know that we grasp the significance of the cross until we grasp how bad sin is. And I certainly think that's true. I also think it's true that it's helpful for us to grasp, or to begin to grasp, how good the reward is that's promised. And I think if we don't grasp how great that reward is, we'll be in that same boat of not really grasping the significance of the cross. If heaven's not that much better than earth, then who cares? But if heaven is infinitely better than anything we've ever experienced, then we got to do whatever it takes to be able to receive that reward. And yeah, we're going to follow Jesus if that's what it takes to receive that reward. Moses is looking ahead to his reward. Paul makes a comparison in his letter to the Corinthians about an athlete running a race in such a way to get a prize. And he makes the transition then to we as followers of Jesus run our lives, live our lives in such a way to get a prize that lasts forever. An athlete runs to get a prize that's temporary. And as I'm thinking through that, like, yeah, there's a lot of truth in that. An athlete will run to get a prize. If you're going to look at me and say, you need to run a certain distance just for fun, probably not. I'm out. Like, I'm not going to run a 5K just for fun. I'm not going to run a half marathon just for fun. I know there are people that do it. I don't understand those people. Great for you. Good. That's not me. Like, there's got to be a big prize at the end of that if you're going to get me out to run. So I looked up this week, the Boston Marathon, probably the most famous running event that I can think of. Sure enough, there's big prize money at the end of that, $150,000. And the winners run it in a couple hours. That's pretty good work for a couple hours worth, pretty good wages for a couple hours worth of work. I'd do something for $75,000 an hour. Sure, I'd run if the prize was big enough. As we look at our lives, though, yeah, the prize is big enough for us to run our lives and to live our lives in such a way that honors God, because the prize is big enough. It's not a little prize at the end. It's a prize that lasts forever. Moses regarded disgrace for the sake of Christ as of greater value than the treasures of Egypt because he was looking ahead to his reward. the other piece that we have to focus on here, it's fun to talk about the reward. It's fun to talk about the treasures, certainly. But the other piece that's important to talk about out of here is Moses chose disgrace. Moses chose disgrace for the sake of Christ. He chose to be mistreated. Sometimes we don't like to talk about that part. We like the rewards, but Jesus says, if you follow me, you will be mistreated. You will face insults, disgrace, persecution. He doesn't say maybe. This isn't, oh, it might happen. He says this will happen. In John 15, Jesus says, if you belong to the world, it would love you as its own. As it is, you do not belong to the world, but I have chosen you out of the world. That is why the world hates you. Remember what I told you, a servant is not greater than his master. If they persecuted me, they will persecute you also. People hated Jesus. And Jesus says, if you're going to follow me, they're going to hate you too. When we choose Jesus, we will suffer. Following God is not a promise that life will be easy. Now, we certainly hope that you will live your lives in a community of other believers who can encourage you, strengthen you, come together with you, and be by your side. But there will be those who dislike you. There will be those who hate you because of Jesus. Came across an article this week that asked a very convicting question. And the question was, do the right kind of people dislike you? Do the right kind of people dislike you? In the article, it was telling a story from 1 Kings. There's a story there where King Ahab and King Jehoshaphat, the king of Israel and the king of Judah, come together and they're about to go to war against the king of Aram, I think. King Ahab is a very wicked man, does not follow God, does not appreciate God at all. King Jehoshaphat follows the Lord. And so as they come together, King Jehoshaphat says, hey, before we go into this, did anybody ask God what we should do? And Ahab goes, oh, yeah. I talked to some of my prophets, and they said, go for it. We'll be fine. We'll be good. Jehoshaphat goes, no. Is there a prophet of the Lord that we can ask about this? Ahab goes, yeah, I wish you wouldn't have brought him up. A guy named Micaiah. I hate him, though, because he always prophesies bad against me. Well, that tells us a little bit about what kind of guy Ahab was. The type of people that you hate says a lot about what kind of person you are. And the fact that Ahab hated this man of the Lord tells us a lot about him. But it also tells us something about Micaiah. Micaiah was hated by Ahab. And the kind of people that dislike you says something about what kind of person you are. And so as this article continued, it asked the question, do the right kind of people dislike you? Do the right kind of people dislike you? And it raises the argument in there that, yeah, the argument will be raised of, well, if we follow Jesus, then we're supposed to love everyone. And everyone should like us then too, right? Because if we are loving, if we are kind, if we have humility and we are gentle with everyone, then people should like us. And yet Jesus says, if the world hated me, they'll hate you too. Do the right kind of people dislike you? And then we don't want them to dislike us because of our obnoxious, arrogant personality. If they dislike us because of that, that's our issue. Paul says we put no stumbling block in front of others other than Christ. Christ is a stumbling block to others. And if we're going to stand for Christ, that will mean that people dislike us. If we stand for the sanctity of life, if we believe, as Jesus says, that life begins at conception, that a baby in a mother's womb is created in the image of God, and we believe that abortion is wrong all the time, we are going to have people dislike us. Do the right kind of people dislike you? If we believe that marriage is between a man and a woman for life, there's going to be people that dislike us, that don't like to hear that don't want to hear that. Do the right kind of people dislike us? when we stand firm in integrity, if we run a business that doesn't cut corners. I see this in insurance every once in a while. A roofing company that will raise the roofing bill by $500 and submit that to the insurance company so that you don't end up paying your deductible. Other people do it, but is it right? And if you choose to run your business and you choose to run your life with integrity, there will be people that dislike you because you won't cut corners for them. That's part of it. Here's one on a very minimal level, but still accurate. If we actually drive the speed limit, if we don't drive above the speed limit, there's going to be people that come up behind us that don't like us. And I say that because I've been that person that's tootling along at 68, 69, and you pull up on somebody that's actually driving the speed limit, and you're like, why is this person driving so slow? But if we live our lives with integrity, if we submit to the authority that's been placed over us, we're going to have people that dislike us. It's a convicting question to ask. Do the right kind of people dislike you? Not because of you, but because of Christ. We talked a little bit at the beginning about choices. How many choices we make in a day, right? We make choices every single day. Some big choices, some little choices. But each day we have the opportunity to make those choices, and sometimes we face those big choices. Usually those big choices are the result of a lot of small choices. And it's the things that we do on a daily basis that lead us to where we are, that define who we are, that we can answer those same questions that Moses does of who am I? Who do I belong with? Who are the group of people that are my people? Moses proves who he is, proves his identity by what he does. He lives out his faith. As we read through this, as we talk about choices, and as I think about Father's Day, I think of another Old Testament character who makes a choice. Joshua makes a choice as he leads his family. And he submits the challenge to the nation of Israel, and he says, choose for yourselves on this day, who will you serve? Whose side are you going to be on? Are you going to choose to follow the gods of your fathers and your family members and the gods from beyond the river? Are you going to choose to follow the gods of the people around you, the culture, the others? Are you just going to choose to live your life in a way that makes them happy? He says, but as for me and my family, we will serve the Lord. We get that opportunity every day to make that choice, to live that out. Who are we? Who do I belong to? How will we answer those questions? By faith, it says that Moses, when he had grown up, refused to be known as the son of Pharaoh's daughter. He chose to be mistreated with the people of God, rather than to enjoy the fleeting pleasures of sin. For he regarded disgrace for the sake of Christ as of greater value than the treasures of Egypt, because he was looking ahead to his reward. Why did he do all of that? Because he was looking ahead to his reward. The writer of Hebrews says that faith is confidence, being sure of what we hope for and certain of what we do not see. That's the reward that we look forward to as we live out our faith. May we live each day by faith. Let me pray. God, thank you for Moses, for his faith, for the way he lived that out in practical ways, that he chose intentionally to live his life in such a way that he identified as one of yours. God, we ask for the courage and the strength to identify as yours, to recognize that we are created in your image and that we choose to follow you in all that we do. I thank you for Jesus, for his death and his resurrection that opens the door for us to experience treasures and rewards beyond what we can even begin to imagine. Lord, help us to stand firm in our faith in all that we do. In Jesus' name, amen.